Hey TCS TV viewers, it's Evelyn Drake coming to you live from the camera store. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight for conversations on identity and personal narrative in photography. And this is in partnership with the Exposure Photography Festival that's happening across Alberta right now. And before we get into the details of tonight's programming, I want to welcome Bethany Kane, who is the Exposure Photography Festival coordinator, to say a few words. Hey Bethany. She can't hear me. Hey Bethany, how are you doing?
Hi, I think you were just on mute there.
That's okay. Yeah, so welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. And you're going to say a few words on behalf of the festival?
Yes, thank you, Evelyn. So on behalf of Exposure's team and board, we'd like to welcome you to our 2022 festival and today's event, presented in partnership with the Camera Store. I would now like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that Exposure Photography Festival takes place on the traditional Treaty 7 territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw and Wesley First Nations. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. So the annual Exposure Photography Festival presents exhibitions that showcase work from internationally renowned practitioners alongside emerging and established talent from Alberta. Exposure provides an exciting meeting place for photographers and art lovers to connect with one another, along with curators and photography professionals from around the world. The festival brings together people of all ages to celebrate Alberta's rich photography scene and thriving creative communities. The Exposure 2022 programme has nearly doubled in size, encompassing over 40 exhibitions that display a wide range of narratives, subjects, practices, and explorations of the photographic medium. Audiences can visit the festival in Calgary, Banff, Canmore, Edmonton, Grimshaw, Red Deer, and Lethbridge. Our exhibitions and events are hosted in galleries, local businesses, outdoors, and online. Today, we are joined by 4 artists who are currently presenting their work in the Exposure curated International Open Call and Emerging Photographers Showcase exhibitions at Contemporary Calgary. Contemporary Calgary is a significant visual arts destination dedicated to modern and contemporary art. We would like to thank our funders, Calgary Arts Development, Alberta Foundation for the Arts, and Chinook Blast, our partners, Contemporary Calgary and ABL Imaging Group, and our sponsor, Sparrow Art Space, for their support. Also, a huge thank you, obviously, to the Camera Store for partnering with us on today's event and for their continued support of Exposure Photography Festival. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks so much, Beth, and of course to the Exposure Photography Festival Board and everyone involved. This has been a wonderful festival that's been going on in the city of Calgary as well as across Alberta for many years, and we're just so thrilled to be able to partner on this event. And tonight, of course, we are going live on YouTube. And speaking of going live, we have our TCS TV Live Dream team that's working behind the scenes. And tonight that includes Gary, Chris, and Graham. And of course, the best part about going live is having the opportunity to interact with all of you. And so this is where your job comes in. Tonight, I want you to ask questions. I want you to tell us some comments that you have. If you see some interesting work, have that chat going throughout. We are going to save questions until the end of our artist presentations, and that's where we're going to have an open dialogue. You guys can continue to ask questions, and we'll pull some throughout the entire chat. And so you can do so by just joining the YouTube chat. Alternatively, if you're not logged into YouTube, you do also have the option to just email me your questions. I'll be checking both sources. So my email address is evelyn@thecamerastore.com, and you can send any comments or questions that you'd like to add to the program tonight. And so for our first artist, we have someone by the name of Cheren Nygren, and she's a fine art photographer from Boston, Massachusetts, and her work explores the way people relate to each other and their physical environment. In this theme that we're talking about tonight, she's going to show her work with connections to our ancestors and our descendants, and how we often feel stronger connections to those than those around us. And through the rooted in personal narratives, the pictures address a universal experience. They integrate in the way in which our family relationships and history play a role in shaping our sense of ourselves and our understanding of our place in the world. So welcome, Diana, and thank you for being our first artist to present tonight.
Thank you, Evelyn. And I actually, as I was thinking about it, find it really ironic to be opening an evening on identity and personal narrative. Since really in my photography, photography has always been to me a way to relate to the outside world and a way of walking around and taking in what's around me, what's outside, what's unfamiliar, a way of slowing down and looking more closely at things and sharing my observations with other people. And this project originated at the beginning of the pandemic, when suddenly everything that photography had been to me kind of shut down, and I had to think about something different to do with photography. So I will start sharing this project. The project is called The Persistence of Family. And when I suddenly found myself in lockdown and not able to go out and adventure and take pictures, I started to try to think about how I was going to make a project using the things around me. And I first started exploring still lives and found that that wasn't really my medium at all. But just before this, had finished a project using compositing, where I took items from multiple pictures and put them together in one picture. And this suddenly was available to me as a really good way to continue to create pictures during the pandemic, I could sit with the thousands of pictures I had in my archive and start to think about how I wanted to tell stories by putting them together. But I think, interestingly, in terms of subject matter, at the same time, my world became much smaller and my world seemed to turn inward. And I was thinking a lot more about family, spending time with, you know, the same group of people that were in my little pod, and thinking a lot about what was important to me and what it meant to have my world reduced to my family, and the extent to which I was made quickly very conscious of the extent to which having a roof over my head and having my family around me, having a little outdoor space that I could go into, that was enough. And everything else, I missed it and it was special, but it was gravy, that I could really be okay with this limited set of things. And so this project evolved as I started to explore my feelings about family and my experience of family. I started to go through old family albums and pull out pictures of my ancestors and played around with putting them together in pictures with my children. I think another thing that inspired this in certain ways was that as a society, we started to, I think about ourselves more consciously within the context of history than we maybe had before then. There was a lot of talk suddenly about the 1918 flu pandemic, and I started to really reflect on how my experience related to the generations that came before me, how it was different, what they may have been thinking of at that time in terms of what their lives meant, and started to see my life and kind of life in general more as a thread that goes through generations, where we act in ways that arise out of our histories, but also take into consideration what we're leaving behind for the people after us, so that our moment in time is very much a part of a continuum. And I wanted to make work that was about that. As I started to play around with putting my ancestors and my children images together, I struggled a lot with what form was going to work for that. And when I initially made the images and started to show them to people, people talked about the ancestors as feeling like ghosts. And I felt really strongly that I didn't want them to feel like ghosts, that wasn't the emotion they had for me at all. And that part of thinking about our ancestors and our histories is that we keep them alive when we think about them. And so their presence for me and their presence in these pictures wasn't really about being kind of haunted by ghosts so much as feeling strongly about the extent to which these people and the memory of them was still with me and was alive with me. And I wanted my children and their children to connect to that and to keep those memories alive and keep that tradition alive. And I think that in this day and age, for my children at least, they're not as conscious of their history and their family and their ancestry as I feel like I was growing up. And so there's a sadness for me around that. And I wanted to give that to them in a certain way and give them that connection and build that history for them in a way that they might be able to access and find meaningful. So ultimately, I settled on this methodology where I print out my ancestors on a sheet of vellum. And so the difference in texture and tonality between the part of the image where the ancestor is and the part where my child is, I hope kind of makes it easier to connect them by emphasizing the separation, because they are in the same space, but each of them is kind of more or less smoothly within his or her own space, that the generation has a space that has an integrity to it. So that hopefully, rather than being thrown together in some magical way, what it started to make me think about, at least, was kind of on TV shows or movies, when a hole opens up and somebody's about to do time travel and this portal opens up into another world. And so I think what I ultimately settled on as a visual format for these was creating a kind of portal through time where these generations could connect with each other. One thing that's been interesting to me in the response to this, because I was hesitant to make work about my family, as much as that was what I was thinking about, I don't actually think there's any reason that anyone else particularly needs to be interested in my family or my family history beyond passing it on to generations of my own family. And what I've found is that what's nice is that people have been able to read their own stories into these images. And there's an expression that I keep encountering over and over again, which is the more personal something gets, the more universal it becomes. And I feel like that is very true with this work, that each of these images has an elaborate family story attached to it and a reason why I've put these people together. So the image that I happen to have landed on, my grandfather on the right was a bit of a brute and a boxer, and my father very proudly tells this kind of horrifying story of when my grandfather owned a vegetable shop and someone came in with a gun to hold up the store, and my grandfather punched him, and with one punch sent the guy flying through the plate glass door and out of the store. And my younger son on the left had just gotten really interested in boxing and had been practicing and polishing his boxing skills. And he's much older. In all of these images, my children are younger. They're now much older. But so there felt a connection to me between these two people and their relationship to boxing. And even though they're very different souls, and yet this picture is out in the world and nobody knows that story, and it doesn't matter. The story kind of helped generate the image, but my hope is that when people look at the images, they're bringing their own stories that are rooted in similar kinds of emotions and similar experiences, but are entirely their own to their experience of the pictures. And the last thing that I wanted to kind of share in thinking about this, because I came to this format of compositing things somewhat apprehensively, because I do love the integrity of the photographic image and was uncertain how I felt about digital manipulation and altering images. And I think what I've learned as I've played with it in time is that one of the gifts that photography gives us is that people tend to look at it, and the first response, even if for just a split second, is to see it as something real and to see it as something that actually happened. And then they may immediately figure out that it's not and try to put together what's going on. But I like to use photography to tell stories by making something that's abstract or something that's conceptual or something that's in your head real. So with these pictures, these people who have never met, who are important to me, can actually for a moment meet. And I think that's the beauty of what we can do and create and play with in photography. But as I say, I think the most important part of the work, for me at least, has been the extent to which everybody responds to it differently and responds to different images because they tap into something about their own lives and their own experiences and their own emotions. And I could not be more grateful for the way these pictures of my family have become meaningful to other people for their own reasons in their own lives and with their own histories. And I think that that's the interesting thing in delving into personal narratives, is the moments when we find out that we're all the same, or that we're all connected, or that we all experience similar emotions. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And I'm excited to hear what the other artists present have to share.
Thank you, Dan. I really love what you said about the more personal something is, the more universal it becomes. I think that's so important, and just love seeing what you put together in your work. I think it's a terrific project, especially during these times where all of our worlds have become so much smaller.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, and we will get to some questions and comments at the end for her work. But next up, we have another guest I'd like to introduce, and her name is Diana Nicholette Jeon, and she's an award-winning photographer based in Honolulu, Hawaii. And she works with multiple types of media in her photographic artistry, and she uses her work to process her emotions about a specific event or a series of events to give a voice to those emotions and so that others can hear them too. She believes that the most interesting space in photography today is where the artist can combine digital techniques with handwork processes to produce one-of-a-kind works. Welcome, Diana, from Honolulu.
Thank you. All right, let me share my screen here. Thank you everyone for coming while we get to this. Full screen. Okay, so my talk is going to be a little bit different than Diana's. A lot of my work is really about personal narrative, which you might have gotten from Evelyn's introduction. So I'm going to go through a few projects fast, and then focus more on the one that's in this festival. So first I want to say that my philosophy for making art is every warrior has a weapon and art is mine. So my art is my way of getting my voice out into the world about the things that are important to me. And this is a series called Self-Exposure. You may or may not think it's photography. This is a grouping of them from a show postcard that I did. Gives you an idea of it. They all start with photographs of myself, and then I photograph other objects. They are commentaries on my personal commentary on societal expectations of American women today. So each one has a specific title and a specific thing that it's speaking about. And that series goes back as far as 2014. It's all shot on iPhones and then developed in the iPad in a program called Procreate. Then I print them out, I draw on them, I use oil sticks on them, and I coat them with 3 coats of encaustic. They're mounted to wood panels. So they end up looking like this. And I think you can tell that this was made around the time of the Women's March. I was at an artist residency in Oregon, and nobody wanted to talk about anything other than like, where's the snowy owl here? And I was really upset about everything that was going on in Washington in the Trump administration. So I picked this project back up again and started working. And so the pink hat is pretty relevant, pretty prevalent in these. And that one is about Me Too, because I was in my youth, when I was younger and prettier, I was a victim of a boss that sexually harassed me and the other 4 girls in the office. So, but back then, people didn't talk about it. It's long before Me Too. So the only thing you could do was quit. So the next project is called Nights as Inexorable as the Sea, and this is about my dreams and my memories. And they're little snippets of work that are in Altoids tins. This is a photograph of that tin, so you can't really see it, but they're actually 3D objects. I fuse 2 lids together. I print out the work where I use a mask to mask it to the shape of the inside of the lid. And I pair these things together that are snippets I remember from dreams. So when I have a dream that I actually remember, and that's not that frequently, I will write down the little snippets I remember of it, and then I'll photograph later. So all of these come from these little snippets of my dream. And in 2018, my personal life took a very bad turn for the worse, which is what the project that's in this show is about. And the dreams got darker because that was what was going on in my life. So I'm going to go back in time now to 2015, and because this project is very close in nature to the one that's in the show. And this one is called I Orfeo, and it's a relation to the Orpheus story. So in 2012, my husband and I had a very bad fight, and he walked out the door saying he wanted a divorce, screamed it out at me and left, and he never came home. And the next morning, I was teaching college at the time, and the next morning I stood in my classroom, and when I opened my mouth to speak, I literally burst into tears in front of my class. It was the most humiliating day of my life, I swear. So eventually, things worked out, and we got back together. But while I was going through this period, the only thing I could think about was a quote from Rilke's translation of Orpheus and Eurydice. And it says that the god put his hand out to stop her, saying with sorrow in his voice, "He has turned around." She could not understand and softly answered, "Who?" And I felt like that was how, like, my husband was like just gone. Who am I married to? I don't know her. So this series is a series of pictures about the 4 or 5 months that we were separated and my experience of that. But it took me 3 years after the fact to begin to make that series, because I need time and distance away from things to be able to work with them. And this I'm working on right now. This is that series, but it's an artist book, and it will be a handmade book. I'm not sure if it'll be accordion or pamphlet bound yet. Right now, the maquette is, the dummy is accordion, but it will have vellum overlay with the text. So this is just as far as I've gotten on it. And that brings us up to this project. So I'm Greek American, and my parents were both born in Greece. I'm first generation, and so when I was little, I read a lot of Greek mythology, or was around a lot of Greek mythology because of that. And Acheron is, in Greek mythology, one of the rivers that goes to Hades. And it's called the River of Woe or the River of Lost Souls, depending on which translation you read. But it's the place where someone named, I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce this right, Cheren ferries souls to Hades and back. So it's the boat that takes the lost souls. And I felt like during this period where I was waiting for my husband to come back, that I was sitting on the banks of the river Akron and waiting for my lost soul to return, who kept telling me he wasn't going to, but he did. So this series of pictures is all about, my feelings, my experience of going through that. And what you're seeing here, this work is not published yet. Only a few of the images are. So you're seeing work that's raw. It's not sure. I'm not sure which ones are going to be in here. So you're really getting an artist's look behind the scenes of what, how I think, what goes into my work. And what's in her hand there, in case you can't see it and you're on a small screen, is a piece of paper that says refusal of time, which is how I felt like I was refusing what was going on during that time. It's actually a brochure from I can't remember that guy's name. There's an artist from South Africa who does charcoal drawings, and he makes them into animations. They're very beautiful. He's very famous. And I saw his work in a museum in Sydney when I went to Sydney a few years ago, and that was the brochure. I no longer have the brochure because it's disintegrated, just like my marriage was. But all of these images are about the cycle that I was going through. This loneliness, this roller coaster ride that I never signed up for, that I never imagined I would be on while my husband was living with another woman. And everything felt foreign. I couldn't make art. This is just all my feelings and emotions going out into the world this way. So what I hope that you get from it is that, this sense of loneliness, this sense of repetition, this sense of one day blending into another, but also this cycle where sometimes I felt horrible and sometimes I felt okay. And like this is hope. My hope was eternal, that things would turn around. And here you have this place in Hawaii where I live, where was covered over with lava, and yet a bloom is growing. So I hope that you get all these sorts of emotions from this project. And I don't know yet which ones will end up with it. Only a few of them are set in stone. This one is the one that's in the exhibition, the one with the girl in the water. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for listening to me.
Absolutely. All right. And yeah, I have lots of questions for you, Diana. And so again, we'll save some to the end, and we have a few in the chat coming along. So I hope you guys keep the questions coming so we can get to some at the end. But yeah, absolutely beautiful. So for our next guest that we have is Jamie Robertson, who's a visual artist and educator from Houston, Texas. And her project, Charting the Africascape of Leon County, Texas, is an autobiographical examination of her family history through documentary photography and the family archive. Jamie, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you're going to be presenting tonight? Jamie, are you there?
She wrote in the chat that she's not in panelist mode.
Oh, we'll have our TCS TV Dream Team on it. There we go. Sorry about that, Jamie. We'll just give her 1 second here. You can just switch to gallery mode for the second here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Wonderful.
Okay.
There we are. Yeah, sorry about that, Jamie.
No problem. No problem. You know, Zoom was
All the
trying.
joys of going live. So thank you so much for
Yes.
joining us tonight. But yeah, can you tell us a little bit about your project as well as what you have in the Exposure Photography Festival?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So just give me 1 second to go to full screen. I want to thank you all so much for being here tonight and giving me the opportunity to share my work with an international audience. Like they said, my name is Jamie Robertson. I'm based out of Houston, Texas. And the work that I'm going to be sharing with you all tonight is from my photo book series, Charting the Afroscape of Leon County, Texas. I first want to talk a little bit about just some background, a framework for how I approached this series. And so all of my work has been centered around my own family history as well as my own heritage as an African American, and reading several different books, such as like The Flash of the Spirit by Robert Farris Thompson was a very seminal piece of work for me, as well as Jeannie Matusimi Ash's Defowski Island monograph. That was one of the first times that I saw Black people in the US in a rural, being represented in photography in a rural setting. The images, even though that particular series is based in South Carolina, it resonated a lot with me and made me realize that my own family albums and family history carried a lot of rich visual imagery. And so, like I'm saying, my family, my heritage, they all play a significant part. This symbol that you see down here, this is a cosmogram from West Central Africa. This also became an organizing principle in my work. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the coming slides. And so Charting the Afroscape of Leon County, Texas is an autobiographical examination of my family history through documentary photography and my family archive. The home place, as my family refers to this plot of land that has been in our family for over, I think it's probably been like over 130 years now at this point, which is no small feat, especially to hold on to a piece of land as a Black family in the segregated South. When my mom and her father and all of them were coming up, it was no small feat at all. And so the home place for us, this land that we've owned for generations, is truly the site of my creative practice and has been for the past 3 to 4 years that I've been working on this project. And so I view the camera as a device that allows me to kind of pierce through, not just capturing what I'm actually seeing, but capturing the more spiritual, ancestral aspects of the landscape of the people who are present. And so Leon County, just to give you guys a little bit of context, I know we're with an international audience. And so Texas, of course, is seen as this, it's kind of a weird state in that it's not, depending on who you ask, it might be seen as a southern state. And then depending on some other people may say it's a southwestern state, but the particular area that I'm talking about and that my family is from would definitely be considered the South. And so Leon County, this is a map from the 1800s that I have superimposed a present day Google map on top of to kind of go back and trace and see how the county shape has changed over time. And then also to kind of place where my family would be. I know it can be really hard for you all to see, but it's very small, detailed, parceled land sections. And so it shows who owned what and where. And, you know, from my understanding, a lot of the land still has these different named parcels on them. And so to kind of get into talking about the work, I used my great-grandparents' houses as the kind of anchor points for this project. And so my great-grandfather's house is, you can see on the left of your screen, that's also a photograph of him as well. His name was Jenkins Lusk. We also called him Big Daddy. That was no one really said grandpa, they just called him Big Daddy. And so the house that you see in the image was his house. It's also the image that is in the exhibition at Contemporary Calgary as well. And the image on the right side of your screen is my great-grandmother's house. This is in Egypt community, which is in Leon County, but it's a smaller unincorporated community. You can see the difference in the two houses in that, these are not taken that far apart away from each other. The house at night is taken in 2017. The house during the day is in 2019. So you can get a sense of, just the amount of care that is left in each place. The photograph of my great-grandfather's house was really special, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. But my great-grandmother's house was primarily the house that I grew up in, and that I was or spent the most time in. Not necessarily grew up, I spent most of my summers there. But I used these two houses as the anchor points for my exploration and documentation of the county and of my family's history as well. And so the term, just to also note, the term Afroscape is not a term, it's not a term that I came up with. It was coined by visual scholar Dwayne Dieterville. And what's really important to note about it is that it's what we would consider the cultural presence of Black or African peoples in the world, wherever that cultural production is happening, where are these overlaps in how they're approaching making homes for themselves or making art, or, and how do all of these things relate on a greater continuum of the African diaspora. And so for me, this series really helps to place this county, these small incorporated towns in my family within the bit larger frame of the African diaspora. And so I want to talk a little bit about three things in regards to this series in relationship to the theme for tonight of personal narratives in photography. So looking at descendants, descendants, the land, as well as the folklore associated with the land itself and the people. And so starting a little bit with the descendants, one of the ways as I structured this body of work is by pairing things, trying to pair archival photographs with my own photographs. And so, and of course, I also want to try to keep things in a sense of passage of time, which is related back to that cosmogram that I mentioned earlier. And so having things ordered from day to night kind of helps further this kind of generations coming and going. And so I have this archival photograph of a domino game at my family reunion from the 1980s. I probably wasn't even born yet when this photograph was taken, because I'm looking at it and I see like my dad's in it, and like he was really skinny in this photograph at that time. And so I don't remember him ever being that small. But then in 2018, we had another family reunion, and of course, there's always a domino game. Like that's pretty essential to our reunions. And the domino table will pretty much stay busy the entire event. People, the players may come and go, but the table is always active and always being worked. And so I think just, this continuous game of domino, and just the fact that even though some of these people may have passed in the archival photo, that their presence is still there with the newer generations playing the game over and over again. And so when talking about the land for me has a very spiritual quality to it, not just in the sense that, it's a very beautiful landscape. There's a lot of this really rich red soil that's really common or been really associated with the southern landscape of the United States. But also the fact that, generations of my family are buried on this land. And also the house that I mentioned before, there are even people who are buried there. We've found markers for relatives. We don't even really know who they are, but they're buried somewhere on the land. And so for me, the land is not just, a beautiful landscape, even though that it is also this kind of container of all of my ancestors. They're all present in the soil. Some aspect of them is there. And so when I'm photographing the landscapes, and particularly at night, I feel that sense even more when I'm out there. I mean, of course, I'm photographing a place where it's more like farm, country, rural setting. And so your next neighbor is maybe 2 or 3 minutes down the road. You're not like in a suburb where you're house to house to house. So there is a lot of areas where there is no light, and you just kind of have to, make the best of the situation, or you'd want to be very vigilant about where you are, because there are like wild animals and things like that out there. But when I'm shooting at night, I definitely feel like another presence there. And this China berry tree, I think is a really good example of that. Because for me, I think in a lot of cultures, trees are often seen as spiritual and having their own kind of, their own kind of like spiritual embodiment, and that or their own life. I mean, they have rings as they continue to grow. But for me, the tree, I also titled this image and captioned Simbi, because that's a type of nature spirit in a lot of African traditions, because there's something very much alive about this image, and very like maybe slightly unsettling a little bit, but still supernatural in the way. And so the landscape for me is very supernatural. And not in like I may have not necessarily in a like a spooky way, but in the sense that my family, all of them are buried here in this place, and I can still feel their presence. And for me, I don't know, for some people that might be kind of spooky, but for me, it's not. And so as I kind of wrap talking about the folklore, my mom, when she was a little girl, told me that her grandmother, my great grandmother, when there was thunderstorms, they would have to go into this smaller little closet in the middle of the house, and no one could talk, no one could say anything, and in the room with them would be a Bible open to Psalms 91 with a knife across it. And Psalms 91 is the psalm of protection. And so I asked her, why does she need a knife across this? What does the knife do? And she didn't have an answer for me. She didn't know. And, later, and as I'm reading, Flash of the Spirit and other books about African and African-American spirituality, I'm realizing that a lot of the spiritual practices from Africa did not leave my family. They just kind of showed up in different ways. And so I had become really obsessed with this story as a child, because even my grandmother, my great grandmother's daughter-in-law, hopefully I'm not confusing you all with the names, but my grandmother, who is still living, keeps Bible. Every room in her house has a Bible open to Psalms 91. Now, she doesn't have a knife across it like my great grandmother, but there's a Bible in every room, and it's open to this psalm. And it's meant to be, and it's not even that they're reading from this particular passage. It becomes more so that the book itself is a talisman or a protection charm against anything that would cause you harm. And so, I became really interested in those kinds of stories and wanting to recreate those images. And so that's what you see here when I recreated this image of the Bible with the knife. And so to close with more of folklore and family history, With my great-grandfather's house, this was the first time that I had ever seen it. I went in search of it in 2019. I had lots of photographs of my great-grandmother's house, but I had no photographs of him. And I felt like I needed that balance of the two of them. And this photograph, I only got 2 or 3 photos at the time, because you can see it's really overgrown. At the time, it was like wild boar season or something like that. So it wasn't the most safest to be out there without any kind of protection, because of the wild animals. But I was able to get this photograph. And what it represents for me is more so, like I said, the land having the essence of my ancestors there, but also that my great-grandfather he lived here, that he stood in this place where I was standing. And while we're in different time periods, he's still kind of there. There's still a part of him there in this house. And so my great-grandfather died the year I was born, earlier in the year. And when my mom didn't know that she was pregnant with me, and she went to the hospital to see him, and, they're laughing, they're talking, they have a really great time. And the next thing she knows, he passes away. And, to this day, she feels that some aspect of him transferred onto me as I'm being formed in the womb. And it is traditionally believed that, babies and elderly people are the closest to the spirit world in African American culture, because, one is on the way out and one is just having arrived into the world. And so, for me, even though I didn't get a chance to see him in 1988 when my mom was visiting him in the hospital, I was still there, even though I was in the womb and he was out in the physical world. There's still this kind of barrier between us, really being in the same time and place together. And so with that, I want to thank you all so much for listening to me talk about this series. It's been a labor of love for the past 3 to 4 years. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to get to share it with you all. If you're interested in knowing more about my work or me, I've included my contact information there, social medias and things. So thank you so much to the Camera Store and Exposure for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you so much, Jamie. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing these stories. The history is incredible. We look forward to chatting with you again during the Q&A. So for our last guest, last but not least, we have Louie Villaneuva. And Louie is a Calgary-based, a local photographer who we know near and dear to our hearts. He's a popular film developer for his business, Neat Film Lab, and we're also very proud that he's part of the Camera Store team. His devotion to the medium, together with an autobiographical approach to his work, gives him generous mechanisms to communicate with. And tonight, Louie is going to share his work of a passage between 2 cultures, one of his family and one of his peers, and the images detail specific moments in his journey, expressing a universal struggle with identity formation. The practice of making photographs provided a third way to tackle growing up, and this selection reveals the unconscious thread throughout his life. And so I want to welcome Louie. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Evelyn. I wanted to open by thanking everybody organizing, all the technical team, my fellow artists, and of course, everybody tuning in. So the project I'm sharing with you folks today, one piece is featured in the festival as part of the Emerging Photographers Showcase at Contemporary Calgary, is called I Had Wished I Was White. Now, I did have a sort of a prepared statement or lecture about this project, but in writing that, in preparing that, I recognized why, first of all, I'm not a writer, and 2, why I take photographs. Because it is another language I know, one that I feel is more effective than the written word, in my case, to say the unsayable, much like how music and visual art can sort of cut through and say things that maybe traditional language can't articulate, at least for particular artists. So instead, I'll be going through my photographs whilst reading an excerpt from an essay called United by Cathy Park Hong. It's from her book, Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning. So I'll share my screen and images here. So if I cut out or something technical happens, please just yell at me. I won't be able to see the chat, so thank you. So again, this is from Cathy Park Hong's essay, United. On paper, my father is the so-called model immigrant. Upon meeting him, strangers have called my father a gentleman for his quiet charisma and kindness, a personality he cultivated from years of selling life insurance and dry cleaning supplies to Americans of all manner of race and class. But like many model immigrants, he can be angry. The question of racial identity can bedevil the children of Asian immigrants, but it's assumed that immigrant parents themselves are unfazed by the race question because they are either working too hard to care or they identify with the country they hail from, and there's nothing more to say on the subject. But the experiences my father acquired as a mechanic in a blue-collar, white Pennsylvania town, and as a life insurance salesman trawling through neighborhoods ranging from Brentwood to South Central, had made him highly sensitive about his own racial identity, to the point where everything came down to race. If we were waiting for a table and somebody was seated before us, he pointed out that it was because we were Asian. If he was seated in the back of the plane, he said it was because we were Asian. When my parents moved me into my dorm room during the first week at Oberlin in Ohio, my father shook my roommate's father's hand, who then asked him where he was from. When my father said, South Korea, my roommate's father eagerly replied that he had fought in the Korean War. My father smiled tightly and said nothing. There are many Caucasians here, my father said quietly when he visited me in my graduate school in Iowa. Where are all the Black people? He asked as we drove into a Walmart parking lot and found a parking spot. Always smile and say hello, my father said. You have to be very polite here. My daughter, my father told the Walmart cashier, is a poet at the Iowa Writers' Workshop. Really, the Walmart cashier said. Don't ever make an illegal U-turn here, my father revised after I made an illegal U-turn, because they will see that you are an Asian driving badly. But by the time I was at Iowa, I had already decided that writing about my Asian identity was juvenile. As a good student of modernism, I was tirelessly committed to the new and was confident that despite my identity, I would be recognized for my formal innovations. I believed this even after I later discovered a blog post called Poe Ethnic Cleansing, written by a former classmate from Iowa who used the coward pseudonym Poetry Snark. He ripped on my first collection by describing it as hack identity politics poems. Then he compared me to Lee Young Lee. Not only do we look alike, we write alike, and declared that the poetry world would be better off if all mediocre minority poets like myself were exterminated. I immediately scrolled down to the comment section. Out of the dozen, there was not one comment that came to my defense, not even a weak-willed, half-hearted, hey man, promoting genocide isn't cool. Instead of being outraged, I was hurt and ashamed. A part of me even believed him. I tried so hard to prove that I was not just another identity politics poet, and he had exposed me for the unintellectual identitarian that I was. My shame was compounded by the fact I didn't know who Poetry Snark was. It could be anyone. Then the post became so popular It was the second link that came up when you Googled me. Who are all those people who clicked onto the site and agreed with him? Did they all want me exterminated? Eventually, when somebody outed my classmate, I was actually relieved. That smarmy asshole? Of course it would be him. My classmate's repellent post was almost easier to handle than my graduate school experience because the slow drip of racism at Iowa was underhanded. I always second-guessed myself, questioning why I was being paranoid. I remember the wall of condescension whenever I brought up racial politics in a workshop. Eventually, I internalized their condescension, mocked other ethnic poetry as too ethnic-y. It was made clear to me that the subject of Asian identity itself was insufficient and inadequate unless it was paired with a meatier subject, like capitalism. I knew other writers of color at Iowa who scrubbed ethnic markers from their poetry and fiction because they didn't want to be branded as identitarians. Looking back, I realized all of them were, curiously, Asian American. Back when I was a graduate student, whether you were a formalist or an avant-gardist, there was a piety about poetic form that was stifling. Any autobiographical reveal, especially if it was racial or sexual, was a sign of weakness. I remember going to the university's main library, one of my favorite refuges, and pursuing the recent archive of graduate student theses. I saw a few Asian names. Not one of them, from what I could tell, had published after graduation. I was afraid I would disappear like them. A year ago, I read from this book at a small gallery in Crown Heights, New York. Afterwards, while I was smoking a cigarette outside with a curator of the event, the gallery manager approached me, a white man with a beard and tattoos, sauntered up to me and volunteered that he was taking a racial awareness seminar, which was a requirement for his other job. My racial awareness mediator is smart, he said. I'm learning a lot. Good, I said. He told me how minorities can't be racist against each other. That's bullshit, I said with a sharp laugh. Are you calling my racial awareness mediator a liar? No, I said. He could just be misinformed. He also said Asians are next in line to be white, he said, crossing his arms. What do you think about that? I think you need a new racial awareness mediator. It's not true? I'm afraid not, I said, turning away from him. Why should I believe you? What? My racial awareness mediator teaches this race stuff all the time. Why should I believe you? Patiently educating a clueless white person about race is draining. It takes all your powers of persuasion because it's more than a chat about race. It's ontological. It's like explaining to a person why you exist, or why you feel pain, or why your reality is distinct from their reality. Except it's even trickier than that, because the person has all of Western history, politics, literature, and mass culture on their side, proving that you don't exist. In other words, I didn't know whether to tell this guy to F off or give him a history lesson. We were here since 1587, I could have said. So what's the holdup? Where's our white Groupon? Most Americans know nothing about Asian Americans. They think Chinese is synecdoche for Asians the way Kleenex is for tissues. They don't understand that we're in this tenuous alliance of many nationalities. There's so many qualifications weighing the we in Asian America. Do I mean Southeast Asian, South Asian, East Asian, and Pacific Islander? Queer and straight, Muslim and non-Muslim, rich and poor? Are all Asians self-hating? What if my cannibalizing ego is not a racial phenomenon, but my own damn problem? Koreans are self-hating, a Filipino friend corrected me over drinks. Filipinos? not so much. It's a unique condition that's distinctly Asian, in that some of us are economically doing better than any other minority group, but we barely exist anywhere in the public eye. Although now it's slowly changing, we have been mostly non-existent in politics, entertainment, and the media, and barely represented in the arts. Hollywood is still so racist against Asians that when there's a rare Asian extra in a film, I tense up for the chinky joke and relax when there isn't one. Asians also have the highest income disparity out of any racial group. Among the working class, Asians are invisible serfs of the garment and service industries, exposed to third world work conditions and sub-minimum wages. But it's assumed that the only group beleaguered by the shrinking welfare state is working class whites. But when we complain, Americans suddenly know everything about us. Why are you pissed? You're next in line to be white. As if we're iPads queued up in an assembly line. So I'll just continue with some of my images here. So the plan is to make a book. I have had a few drafts here and there. I am talking to a few publishers, but I am waiting. I'm taking my time. You can't just press print and redo with things like this. So sharing the work, receiving feedback is very helpful to me throughout this process. These are actually this is the first time a lot of people are seeing a lot of this work outside of very close friends and partners. So I appreciate any feedback I can get. I am definitely inspired by more of like a loose narrative structure when it comes to the photographic sequence, which is why I do take a lot of inspiration from poetry, but also have problems with reconciling text and image, especially when they're side by side, because they are so similar in terms of like the subtlety of trying to say something. I find if text and image, especially poetry and photography, are next to each other, they tend to clash or compete for attention. At the same time, I like that challenge, so I'm ready to explore that avenue in my work going forward. And I love how Diana mentioned the concept of how the more personal you make something, the more universal it can be. I've always gravitated toward that statement, and I always thought that Deanne Arbus was the one to coin that phrase, but it was actually her teacher, Lizette Medell, another two great photographers I really admire. So yeah, these are drawn from the 10 years I've been working, probably over 100,000 negatives and photographs. So I looked through all of it to essentially assemble the sequence we have here that hopefully wordlessly expresses the thesis. Because with an early draft of the work, I was given the one critique of they looked at the photographs and they knew the title I had wished I was white and didn't square the two and asked and told me to prove my thesis with my photographs. So hopefully I've accomplished that now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Louie. That was wonderful. And to all of the artists tonight, thank you for sharing your vulnerability, your stories. This has been incredible, and I hope we can bring everybody on with a gallery view. So I'm just going to get the team to make an adjustment here. There we go. We have all of our guests. And so I'm going to start with a few questions, and then Bethany Kane from the Exposure Photography Festival is going to join me in questioning some of you. Now, Louie, since we just finished up with yours, I'm actually going to start with you. And this was actually a question that I was talking with some of the team about before we got started with Graham and Chris. And one of the things that we're curious about with your work in particular is, do you find that all of your work has sort of a universal narrative thread, or do you think that there's a personal narrative with each individual image? And just to add on to that, do you prefer to showcase your work in more of a series, or do you feel that that your work also has a place standing on its own as its own unique piece of poetry?
Yeah, I'll address that. So, with finding a personal narrative or some sort of narrative thread throughout my work in general, I would say no. It's definitely an imposition on my part when I look at my work after the fact. Often my project work draws from a retrospective look at the photos I've made. Although moving forward, I'm happy to explore more intentionality and slower sort of ways of working. Because hard drives do pile up and binders full of negatives are a thing. But that being said, I find with that sort of crisis of identity growing up especially, going back and forth between different values, sometimes swinging left to right to left or right, I find that photography itself has given me a lot and given me that sort of identity to follow, that piece of my brain that would otherwise fall victim to maybe extremism or something like that. So I'm definitely grateful for photography as a medium in that respect. And then the second, sorry, what was the second question?
Just if you prefer to showcase your work more in a series of images, or do you find more comfort, I guess, in having one image at a time on their own?
Yeah. So when I first started out, I certainly fell victim to the mindset of making a singular iconic image and sort of having that as representative of who I am as an artist, etc. But the more and more I delved into not necessarily overt storytelling, but more subtle poetic work, especially in photo books, especially the contemporary photo book, where if we wanted to tell a very overt, explicit story, we would be writing a novel. Instead, we're using photographs. I find the sequence of images just so much more fulfilling as a consumer of photography, and therefore it spills into what I make too and how I like to present work.
Excellent. Thank you, Louie. A question here we have is for Diana Shreen Nygren about your the locations and placements you choose for each story. They said that they're pulled into seeing the composites as if each one of them were the truth. So can you just talk a little bit about your workflow and how you found those locations and how you actually paired them up with the other images? I know you touched on it briefly, but could you elaborate a little bit?
With this project, and this is the case, I think, with most of my projects, they arise out of things that I've been shooting before. So the landscapes weren't shot for the project, but came out of a fascination that I had for a period of time with the tradition, especially I think in New England, where I live and grew up, of holding on to old places and really treasuring what's old and having this nostalgic feeling about kind of these better days when, you know, we lived in farms and had clapboard houses, and we have a tendency in New England to hold on to that history. And so I was doing a lot of photographing of those kinds of places as I traveled throughout New England. But then they seemed fitting for this project because it was where I grew up. It was where my children were growing up. It was where much of my family lived for the last couple of generations. But it also straddled all of the periods of time that I was addressing in the images because of the way that the locations kind of refused to give up old places and stood outside of time. And I think in terms of the concept of the personal becoming universal, that hopefully what it does in the series is that they become kind of any place, anytime. And so I think the ones that work most successfully are the locations that lose their specificity in a certain way and could be anywhere and at any moment in time. And that lets the story really dominate and take on its own life.
This is a question here for Diana Nicolette Gian. I said before that it takes a lot of courage, I think, to be able to express some of these vulnerabilities. And you shared a lot of very intimate details about your journey individually and then as an artist. What was it that gave you the courage to be able to share some of these experiences, both through your work photographically, but also talking about them as you are today?
I don't have an answer for that. It's just sort of what I need to do as a person and as an artist. I'm really sorry about the sunlight here. I get this afternoon Waikiki sun and I'm trying to escape it, but there we go.
We're all very envious.
It's very strong.
Yes.
In this part of the day. I just feel like I need to get these things out of me. Mm-hmm. And so they come out. But I also know that when I do that, I'm also helping other people too, who have suffered the same thing. Because part of the things that I've gone through that I, show in this work, I wouldn't have made it through were it not for some, sort of support groups, people that I became friends with in their own similar circumstance to me. And so I know that sharing this work, somebody else who is in that place can be like, wow, she made it through, because you feel like you want to die. She made it through, and I can do that too. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but I can do that too. And so I think by, sharing these kind of stories, we sort of make it okay to talk about these things.
Mm-hmm. And just to add on to that, have you found in your own personal life that it's been therapeutic once you are getting those things out, or does it sometimes ever turn around on you? Like, does it sometimes bring out more than you anticipated?
It's super cathartic to do this kind of work, but it's also very, very hard. There's a reason it took 3 years before I did the Eye or Fail project, and that was because I couldn't look at it. This time, I had 2 years that passed during it, so I had some distance from it just in being inside the situation, but I literally could not make art for most of the time that I was going through those 2 years. It took away my ability to make art. It was really scary because I thought, what am I going to do? With myself? And so it is really cathartic to get this stuff out, but you're also literally reliving these experiences. Mm-hmm. And I write for a couple of publications about photography, and I can't remember whose project it was that I wrote about that this came up. But there was some project I wrote about a woman who had lost her son and does a lot of work about that. And I wrote about this, and I looked up the neurobiology. And it turns out that when we remember these things, there's something going on in our brain that we are literally reliving it, and that's why it's really painful, and it's why it's really cathartic. And there's you know, I'm no scientist. I'm sure my language simplified it beyond belief, but you get the idea of it. So it is actually physiologically cathartic, but it's also physiologically like you're reliving it.
Thank you. And I have a question for Jamie that's sort of on the same vein here. So you talked a lot about very personal family situations, and you're getting into some of these very intimate details about your history and your ancestors. What was your family's reaction to your work, and were they very trusting when you're sort of putting a lot of these things out there, or was there any friction amongst your family there?
My family is very supportive of everything that I'm doing. They love actually that that I'm, you know, sharing all of this with the world, which, you know, I was, you know, because I don't want them to feel like I'm exploiting their stories or anything in that way, but they're all of our stories, as in like my family, me, they're all our stories. But they really enjoy that the work is being made and put out there, because they see the other end of it, like me making it, me standing out in the dark, like taking photographs of the house at night, and they're like, what are you doing, you know? But seeing the work in, you know, a gallery, or me doing artist talks and talking about our history, I think for them it's really special because, you know, like I was saying, this community, the Black community in Leon County makes up about like 7.3% of the people there. And in the state of Texas, Black people make up about 12.9% of the population. So to share stories of Black people in Texas, I think is really important, and it needs to be done. I would encourage more people to share those kinds of stories because they're often overlooked. So they're really excited about me putting the work out there and the stories. And I've also found that other people have, you know, had similar experiences. So it's not necessarily that it's even unique to my family, like the whole thing with the Bible and the knife. I've had other people say they've had certain things like their grandmother does that's very, like it's supposed to be Christian, but it's not really that Christian, you know. There's another influence coming in. So yeah, they're definitely supportive of it.
That's wonderful. Well, I'm going to put Bethany Kane on the spot because I know she had a few questions that she wanted to ask. So you can go ahead, Bethany.
I just wanted to say thank you for 4 just amazing presentations. You know, thank you for sharing all your, you know, personal experiences with us and, you know, insights into your work and practice. I guess my first question is, I was just wondering, I think Diana touched upon this a little earlier, but was there anything that you gained or learned personally through working, you know, on these projects? Anybody can go first.
Yeah, Claire.
It's a big question, I guess, so sorry.
That's okay. Which
Yeah,
Diana
sure.
were you
I'll
asking
jump
her?
in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, wanting to make this work, I had a Lightroom catalog with like work from the last year and trying to find this thread. It made me sit down and rescan all of my negatives. It was like 600 rolls of film. It took like 3 months. And yeah, that was definitely something I had to gain from getting off my ass and doing that, because otherwise, because now I do have a very accessible, very organized archive, all at like the quality I want if I ever want to draw from it, together with looking through and scanning family archives as well and old photographs.
Fantastic. Anybody else want to add to that?
I kind of tangentially the project, but very much inspired and driven by the project, dove into Ancestry big time and started to really try to put together a family history. So I think on the personal dimension, it led me to really kind of try to piece together and follow the family story and get it down before it's hard to locate.
I have a question here actually that was sent to me, and this one's for Jamie. Is your art a way of sharing not only your family history, but also the history for some Black people in the South, or is it mainly a way for you to connect with your family, both past and present?
I feel like it's all of the above. Especially when I first started my MFA in 2017, it really was about starting with what I knew. And as I've, been out of school for the past 2 years, I've started to transition more into looking at the greater collective of Black narratives in the South, and particularly the Gulf South. That's the region that I'm in. And so it's been, I always thought of my, like, I guess, like I was saying a little bit earlier, I've always thought about my family's history is not like a isolated event or isolated things, that they are part of a much larger diaspora of stories and narratives of Black people in the Americas as a whole. And so it definitely feel like it's all of the above. Like it's, a way for me to connect with my ancestors, but also to connect with other people. And I mean, also I've had people who don't identify as Black connect with the work as well, because there are things about it that are, jump across cultures as well. So I would say it's all of the above.
Excellent. And this
I just wanted to comment on that, Jamie, that I agree. I think it's really interesting that, and this gets back to kind of the more personal it is, the more universal it is, that when I started working on my project, it was relevant to me that my ancestors were Eastern European Jews who had escaped, pogroms in Ukraine or whatever. And all kinds of people relate to the images, and that story and that history and that culture isn't a part of it for them. And that doesn't matter. It's fine. It's these stories bring up universal themes, even when they come out of very specific cultural origins.
Yeah, absolutely.
A question for Diana Nicholette Jeon. What is one thing that you think photographers or photographic artists should be aware of when it comes to understanding the identity of their work? What do they need to have awareness about when they're putting it out there?
What an interesting question for me. I personally feel like any artist, no matter what field of art they're in, needs to have a really good understanding of why they make what they make. Because if you don't understand that, you're not going to make work that coherently expresses that. And it's hard enough to make work that coherently expresses it when you do understand why you make what you make, right? To be able to get that point across to other people succinctly and coherently. So if you don't know, chances are what you make is going to be sort of random or happenstance or luck. That it turns out well, because you really have to understand, what you're doing and why you're doing it to be able to come up with something good. There's 4 other people here. They may have different opinions. That's just mine. I think it's interesting that somebody picked me out for that question.
Well, let's spread it around, because I think it's something that all of you could add to as well. Louie, what about you? What do you think is important about understanding about your own work to be able to express your identity within it?
Yeah, so I mean, when the objective is to express identity or express something within oneself, I always go back to this reference, a show at the MoMA curated by John Sarkowski a very long time ago called Mirrors and Windows. And he kind of separated several photographers' work into the category of mirror photographer and window photographer, about how a mirror photographer is often saying something within themselves that they're trying to articulate, and a window photographer is out in the world putting a frame upon the world and letting that sort of speak to as the work. Now, it's not always as that binary like everything else, but I find it an interesting exercise to both place your own work or way of working in that dichotomy, or work that you see out in the world. So for me personally, historically, I've always just made photographs of whatever interested me. Camera is always sort of ever present. And of course, the projects were retrospective in that way. But I do find the formalism of conceptual practice, like having the idea and making the photograph the idea, is also extremely valuable, and also a way that I'm exploring more and more as I continue to make photos.
Excellent, thank you. What about you, Diana? Shreen?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about it. I think that I've been kind of learning in my photographic practice, in part, that's underpins the difference between a body of work and a great image, that you can't really make a body of work that coheres and makes sense and says anything that's kind of internally consistent without really understanding, as Diana said, why you're saying it and where it's coming from and what the work is about. You can make a great shot without understanding that, but for work to come together as a body, you need to find that insight.
Yeah, and Jamie, let me spin it a little bit for you as well, but in your work, what do you find is most important in being able to communicate the messaging behind your work? Do you find that it's very important to be able to articulate the different stories that go behind the work, or do you think that it's important for the work to be able to stand on its own without that?
You know, I'm still in a place where I'm figuring that out for that body of work, because I've run into times where people have told me the things that I was saying wasn't present in the work. And I completely disagree with them for saying those things. Or, you know, I realized that, you know, because I'm making work about African-American history, particularly my own history, people sometimes will have very limited views of what that history should be, or won't be open enough to consider, you know, other narratives other than the mainstream narratives about African Americans in the United States. And so I'm still kind of on the fence. I do feel that your work should be able to stand on its own, but I also don't think that, you know, I think the stories help kind of add an extra layer for people to really understand my thought process as an artist. And so, you know, if I'm not present and the work is present, I think that, you know, what it really comes down to is going to be, like, I guess going back to what Diana said, like having this fully fleshed out series and how these images all work together as a whole to kind of get my point across, or the feeling that I have about the work across.
Fantastic. Bethany, did you have any other questions that you wanted to ask the artists?
I guess just one thing that I picked up on is so in your presentations, Diana talks about this sort of hesitancy to make work on your family, and then other Diana mentions, you know, the project was, you know, you sort of like piled all your feelings and emotions, you know, into the project and put it out in the world. And I was just wondering, you know, for photographers who are working in similar ways, and we also talk about, like, you know, the more personal something is, the more universal it becomes. And you just sort of have this like push and pull all the time, you know. In a previous talk this year for Exposure, one of the artists who works, you know, in similar ways, sort of like putting his personal experiences into his work, sort of said, I guess a good way of approaching it, you have to be like this good editor and sort of reflect on your work all the time before, you know, you put these things out into the public. And I just wanted to learn more about this sort of like push and pull, and how do you personally decide, you know, what to like disseminate into the public eye? And, you know, was there any works where you thought, you know, maybe that one's a bit too much, or am I saying enough with this work? So yeah, I guess I'm just sort of like spewing out like what my thoughts are, and what, what I think would be quite interesting to learn about. So again, it's a question for all of you in a way.
Personally, I think that's the hardest thing is, it's referred to as killing the darlings. There's ones that you love for whatever reason you're attached to it. It speaks to you and it doesn't work with the rest of the series, or nobody else gets it but you. And then there's other ones, like this happened to me today. I was in a workshop and we were looking at this body of work, and I was putting something that I did last week, and my statement as soon as I showed it was, I don't like this one. And the two people who led the workshop were like, we love this one. So that process of narrowing down what's going to stay and what's going to go is not that easy. It's really difficult to get to the point where it speaks to you.
Oh, we lost you there, Diana.
Or that it says enough without saying too much.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Louie, could you add on to that how you edit your pieces down to your body of work?
Did you ask?
Oh, I think my mic cut out as well. Diana, you were going to say something. Diana Shreen?
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I think part of what the connection between the universal and the personal often comes down to is emotions. And you have as an artist, you have all kinds of associations with the work that you make and reasons that you're attached to various pieces, as Diana said. And the ones that ultimately are going to succeed in communicating to somebody else are the ones that convey the emotion that you're trying to get at. So it's almost like the personal story falls away and the emotion comes across clearly. And those are the pieces I think that, I find at the end of the day connect. And often you have to just bounce them off other people and get feedback to see when they are and aren't reading that emotion, because it's really hard to tell on your own.
Louie, could you touch on your editing process and how you are able to narrow your work down when you're creating a body of work?
Yeah, I like the time. So that is one aspect of the inconvenience of film that helps me sort of separate myself from the photographs that in the moment I worked really hard for, or saw the happenstance be like extremely once in a lifetime, and sort of edit my own work almost like it's somebody else's. On top of staying organized in terms of subject matter, and also just the plain Jane activity of printing out photographs, having them in front of you physically and moving and jumbling them around. That is how I decided, sort of at least in the later stages of what I wanted to include in the photographs I showed today. Together, I mean, so much of it is inarticulable. So much of it is feeling. So in terms of like how to decide, especially in this way of working in more sort of our artistic spectrum of photography, where it's like the photos my mom takes on her phone, all the way to bird and nature photography, all the way to the stuff that's hung in galleries. All of that is photography. And to me, that's like a very like generous and wonderful thing. But in terms of the conventions of art photography, you can't quite make a rubric of what works and what doesn't, or what you should keep and what you shouldn't keep. So really, it's testing yourself as an audience and testing the folks that you respect and love in terms of their eye and feedback.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I think we're going to wrap things up here tonight. And so what I would like to do is just do a quick roundtable of all of our artists to talk about what things you have coming up next and where people can find more of your work. So we'll go in order of the presentation. So Diana, Shreen, we'll start with you.
So you can find more of my work, hopefully with all of the information around this. My name is printed there because I know it's a mouthful, but my website is dianacherennygren.com. My Instagram is at Diana Cheren Nygren Photography. And those are the two primary places. I'm currently working on a project that I'm just starting to put out into the world called The World Needs a Superhero. And again, it is composite images of kind of futuristic bleak urban environments and pictures of my children. And it kind of posits that children, with their imagination and their ability to see possibility in everything and to seize the world with their whole hearts, possess the qualities that we need right now to confront the challenges in front of society, which for adults, I think, feel a little overwhelmingly bleak.
Thank you. And yes, I will put all of your Instagram handles and website links in the chat as well, so then people can easily click on those. And then next we have Diana Nicholette Jeon.
So my Instagram and my website are both my name. My Twitter is Diana N. Jeon, and my Facebook is my name. So the only one that goes off the rails is the Twitter, because they won't let you do it long enough to put my whole name. And the only show I have coming up is, which Diana will also be in, is in July in New York City at Foley Gallery, a group show. But that's the only thing I have scheduled right now. I do have a piece in a show at the Griffin Museum. You probably do too, Diana. And that's called Once Upon a Time, and it's at the Lafayette outlet of the Griffin Museum. And I think it's going to be up for another couple of weeks, maybe a month more.
Yeah, there's going to be a reception on March 6th, a kind of closing reception on March 6th. So anybody who is in the Boston area at all, you can mark March 6th on your calendars.
Awesome. And Jamie, what about you?
So I have 2 more artist talks coming up in March. On March 15th, I'll be, and they're both with SF Camera Work in California. So on March 15th, I'll be doing my solo artist talk as a part of the Forecast 2021. I'm one of the artists featured in that exhibition. And so that'll be at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on March 15th. And then the following week on March 22nd, I'll be a part of another panel with SF Camera Work called Uncovering, I'm like reading it now, Uncovering Histories, Crystallizing Memory, Photography, and Placemaking. So that should also be another really great panel. That's going to be at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard. If you can find me on Instagram is the best place to keep up with what I'm doing at her name is _Jamie, as well as I think just Instagram. And then of course my website, jamievrobertson.com, to see the rest of my work. I have other work outside of the Charting the Afroscape series. So, but yeah, those are the things I have coming up. So more talking for me.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll supply again some of those links in the comments for you guys here. And then Louie, what about you? What do you got going on?
Hey, yeah. So yeah, as I said, part of the Emerging Photographer Showcase at Contemporary Calgary until Sunday. And also exposure and conversation at the mini galleries here in town at Crescent Heights. That's also until Sunday. And a really big thing I can't say. It's unannounced. It's a nomination thing, but you can keep in touch just through my Instagram at LOUIE_V_CA, or just Louie V. So that's Louie with an E, V.ca. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yes, well, we're hoping we can drag you back on camera eventually, Louie. Again, right here. So thank you very much. Bethany, did you want to have any closing words just about Exposure Photography Festival? What more things you guys have coming on the next week before it closes out?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, as Louie mentioned, the exhibitions are still on until Sunday. So if you haven't visited already, please do. And for our international audiences, you can see, if you go to the Exposure website, there's a bit of information on each of the exhibiting artists at Contemporary Calgary as well. So, you can go and engage with that. Regarding other events, we have one on, so I'm just looking at my calendar here, out of view. We have one on Saturday, 100 Heroines, who are an organisation based in the UK that promote female photographers, are hosting an event on Saturday, so please join into that. All details are on the Exposure website. And yeah, we're coming to the end of the festival, but there's still a lot going on, and a lot of things, finish this weekend. So do have a look at our website and make sure you go see it all. And I just wanted to thank everybody involved today. Thank you for all of the audience members for joining us and spending your Wednesday evening with us. And thank you to all the artists for, all the prep that it takes to put your presentations together. So thank you for all that. And obviously, big thank you to the Camera Store, who are always very brilliant and lovely to work with.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Bethany, and to all of our artists tonight. It was phenomenal hearing your stories and having you just speak about your work in general. And so I want to thank again everyone for tuning in, and we hope that we'll be able to catch you right here on TCS TV.